Well, we have with us right now a very special guest, and his name is Alan Mendenhall. He is the Associate Dean and Executive Director of the Blackstone Center for Law and Liberty. Good afternoon, Alan.
Hi, Donna. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing wonderful. How are you doing? Welcome to the show.
Doing very well. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'll have to tell you, I love our sessions. I love when you're on the show, and our listeners love listening to you as well. And, boy, it's been a busy time for you.
It sure has. I've been on the road quite a bit lately, and I've been doing a lot of TV and radio, and I had my second book published earlier this year, and I have 2 more books coming out this summer. So It has been very busy, and I'm very excited and very blessed right now.
Yeah, you are. Well, let's talk a little bit about your books.
Sure. Well, the 2 I have forthcoming are about, one's about a lawyer and writer named John William Corrington, and the other one is a book of just creative nonfiction essays. So I guess I'll start by talking about John William Corrington because he's such an interesting guy. He was actually born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1932, but his family was from Memphis, Tennessee. They had traveled up to Ohio to find work during the Great Depression. But Corrington was a Southerner through and through, always very proud about his heritage, and he spent most of his life below the Mason-Dixon line. He moved to Shreveport, Louisiana when he was 10 years old, and he was raised in a Jesuit high school. And he had a very interesting education. I mean, he grew up playing instruments and reading voraciously. And then he goes to Centenary College and gets a bachelor's, and then he gets his master's in Renaissance literature from Rice University. This would have been in the early 60s. And then he gets married in 1960. This is actually to his second wife. He had gotten married as a teenager, and the relationship between him and his first wife did not work out. It was a very brief sort of teenage romance that did not have the blessing of the parents. And but at any rate, in 1960, he gets married. He moves to LSU, becomes an English professor there, and starts writing a lot of poetry. He writes several books of poetry and begins work on his first novel. And then a few years later, in the early 1970s, he becomes disenchanted with teaching English. And by the way, during that time, he earns his doctorate from the University of Sussex, England. But he becomes disenchanted with the English profession because he thought that colleges were teaching Marxism and getting rid of the traditional humanities curriculum and substituting political agitation for scholarly exploration. And so he decides to go to law school. He goes to Tulane Law School. And at this point, he has already written something like 5 books of poetry. He's written a couple novels. Well, during his first year of law school, when most students are studying, he is writing the screenplay for The Battle for the Planet of the Apes. So he writes that screenplay as a law student. And then he goes on in his later career, and he writes film scripts for The Omega Man, which starred Charlton Heston. He wrote Boxcar Bertha, a movie called The Arena in 1972. And as he gets older, he begins writing for daytime television. And I think he finds that the TV writing makes more money. So he begins as a poet, moves to a novelist, then starts writing film scripts, then starts writing for TV. He wrote for Search for Tomorrow, Another World, General Hospital, Capital, One Life to Live, several different television shows. And then he died prematurely. He died in his mid-50s in 1988. And it was sort of a surprise to everyone. But he's an interesting figure because he is so proudly Southern, which is unusual sometimes among literary types. And he was a staunch conservative, and he hung out with Hollywood elites, but also with sort of beatnik poets like Charles Bukowski. So he has a wide variety of interests and a wide variety of talents, which makes him really, really unique.
Yeah, I'll say, because he's an attorney and, writing for soap operas. When
Writing
you
for
think
soap
about
operas.
that,
Yeah.
so he really knew how to tug. I mean, Southerners know how to tug at your heart,
Well, and they can tell a story, and he learned how to
You
tell
better
stories.
believe it.
And he was always proud of his ability to write dialogue. I think that was one thing that set him apart from other authors. In fact, he did a lot of co-writing with his wife, Joyce Corrington, who was herself a fascinating person. She had a PhD in chemistry, and she was better with plot, so she would help him with plot and help him come up with the stories. And he was really good with the narrative, and they sort of worked together. But you're right, he was a jack of all trades. I mean, he was a musician, a poet, a speaker, a novelist, a classicist, and that he studied, ancient Greek, ancient Rome, and early Christianity. So he was something of a theologian as well, a philosopher. Sometimes he was a cowboy. He had that cowboy look with jeans and the big belt buckle. He was a professor. Sometimes he was a sophisticate. Sometimes you would see him with kind of tweed sport coats and ties and a pipe. He was a literary critic. He was, a Hollywood habitue, a lawyer, a screenwriter, a Catholic husband, father, a friend. He was so many things to so many people. And one interesting thing about working on this book over the years has been getting to know his former students and his family members and his friends and all kinds of people who knew him over the years. And
so what did the people
really
say about him who were the closest to him?
Well, I guess different things. I spent a lot of time with Joyce Corrington, his widow, and she lives in New Orleans, and I've been down there and stayed with her, and she of course has a lifetime of memories to share. So she says a lot of things, but some of his most touching tributes come from his students, who just found him to be not only a fascinating person, but also someone genuinely interested in their learning. And he would go above and beyond and hang out with students after class, and they would go, say, to a bar and maybe have drinks and talk about, some novel or some element of philosophy. Corrington was a student of the philosopher Eric Voegelin himself. And in the 1970s, he started writing in the vein of Eric Voegelin. Voegelin's philosophy is actually very dense and complex and sort of riddled with Greek vocabulary and Indian vocabulary, and it's challenging. But a lot of what I have done is taken some of Corrington's previously unpublished essays and writings and speeches and put them into the book so that they can appear to the public really for the first time.
So, well, I'll tell you what, he reminds me of you. Some people some people can have so many, and why is this? Some people can have so many careers and do just so many things and still take in more, and then some people only have one career. Why is that?
Oh gosh, I wish I had a good answer to that. I don't. I don't know. But I think in Corrington's case, he was just a curious person, and he let he followed his curiosity. He sought out answers to questions, and that led him to, that led him in different directions. He wasn't always, financially stable in those early years. He had some rough patches, but he gradually learned what audiences would like. I think he didn't make any money on his poetry, and his novels sold, okay, but they weren't bestsellers by any measure. And then as he moved into film and television writing, he really found what people liked. Now I don't think he liked writing in that mode as much as he liked writing, say, fiction and short stories and poetry, but he did enjoy the paychecks.
Oh yeah, and something said about that,
Sure,
and
absolutely.
if the thing you really like to do on the side, which is, it sounds like. But I've often heard this said: find the person who is the busiest. Especially ministers in a church will say this. They'll say, find the busiest person in your church and give them a project to do, and they will get it done.
I've heard that too. And I don't know what that. Maybe there's something to that. I don't know, but I have definitely heard that.
And then, but why did you choose Mr. Currington to write about? What was the thought process?
Well, part of the work is bringing to light his own writing. So I'm publishing stuff that he had just in handwritten note form. His papers were collected and archived at Centenary College, and I was able to get a hold of those and dig through them. They're fascinating letters with a lot of different people, and part of it was because I did see some of myself in him. He reminded me of myself in a lot of ways, and I found that to be interesting. I found a lot of what he wrote to be agreeable to my own views, and so finding sort of a like-minded person is always interesting. But finding a like-minded person who is no longer with us is not as common. It's not as common to go read history and find someone that you just identify with. And it was like meeting a friend, although the friend is not living.
But it's so great that you're bringing this to life. Some of his unpublished items you're bringing to life. So that's just an awesome thing you're doing as well. I wonder what it was like for him, though, to be in the world. He's very conservative. To be in the world of Hollywood.
Yeah, that's one element of his biography that I would like to know more about. He moved to Malibu, and in fact, the house in Malibu they owned for quite some time, and I think that's actually where he was when he passed away, sort of in an untimely way in 1988. He had some interesting brush-ups with other conservatives in the 1980s, and one example of that is Ronald Reagan had initially named Mel Bradford to head up the National Endowment for Humanities, and Mel Bradford was a Southern conservative, sort of an unreconstructed Southerner, I guess is one way to put it. And Mel Bradford was very critical of Abraham Lincoln. And his appointment drew a lot of controversy during the 1980s. Not from people on the left, but from people on the right. There was a budding divide between the paleoconservatives and the neoconservatives, with the neoconservatives taking issue with Mel Bradford's more traditionalist Southern conservatism. In fact, Bradford called himself a reactionary. But what happened is that Reagan ended up withdrawing that appointment and appointing Bill Bennett to that spot, and that was sort of a critical moment in late 20th century conservatism, because it defined the divide between that traditionalist paleoconservative side of the conservative movement and the new kind of neoconservative side, which emerged out of what had previously been leftism, but you had a lot of disaffected leftists who were moving to the right, as represented by, say, the philosopher Irving Kristol, father of Bill Kristol, the Weekly Standard guy who's on Fox News all the time. But Corrington took Mel Bradford's side in that split and supported him. And he had met Mel Bradford at a conference in 1966 at Northwestern State College, and Mel Bradford had told Corrington that Corrington's novel, In Wait for the Night, rivaled William Faulkner's novel, The Unvanquished, in the enormity of its themes and approaches. And so Corrington was just flattered by this and struck up a friendship with Mel Bradford and invited Mel Bradford to Vanderbilt University to participate in a conference on Eric Voegelin's thought many years later. And so in this respect, Corrington did fall into that Southern conservative literary tradition with people like Donald Davidson and Alan Tate and Andrew Nelson Lytle and John Crow Ransom, that he was like a latter-day Southern fugitive, I guess you could say. There were all these...
fugitive is the correct word.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, there were a collection of authors about a generation before Corrington who had come together to write a book, I'll Take My Stand, and they were defending traditional Southern values and experience from an agrarian philosophical perspective, and Corrington was sort of that mold. He identified with people from George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison all the way up to Andrew Jackson and Jefferson Davis and John C. Calhoun, Robert E. Lee, and I think there was something about the mythology of Southern war heroes that appealed to him.
Mm-hmm. Because in essence, he's being a war hero where he is planted, and that. But something, diversity helps you grow.
It sure does. Yep, it sure does.
And he had to be in the middle of a lot of it.
Well, and one interesting thing about Corrington and his views of the South is he is very attentive to the concerns of African American figures, both the ones that were in his political ambit, the people that he came into contact with, and his friends and associates, and also the way he rendered them in his fiction. He was. He talked about the South as being owned equally by blacks and whites, and that both cultures were necessary to provide what Southernness is. That there couldn't be a Southern identity or a Southern character without the contributions of both blacks and whites.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I think that's just manifestly true.
And a lot of people from different parts of the country get the wrong idea about how we feel, with blacks and whites together. Because, and I'll have to say this, back in the 60s, my mother worked at a place, and she in the Anniston, Oxford area. And there was a lady, I'll never forget this lady, and she was black, and she and Mother were just the best of friends. Her name was Willa Dean. And I remember Willa Dean, and I remember my brother and I would say, if something were to happen to Mother and Daddy and they were being a wreck, I bet Willa Dean would raise us. I mean, we were that close to her, and she was just an amazing lady. And so, I've met people, from the northern states who would say, "Oh, there's such diversity in Alabama where you're from," and I said, this is just from the liberal media trying to make a spin on it, because that was never that way in our family.
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of unfairness with the treatment of Southerners in popular media, as you can see from the Saturday Night Live depiction of Jeff Sessions. It's you can take issue with a person's political views, of course, but sort of the
but it's an attack on. I was about to say that's an attack on his character.
Yeah, his character and it's sort of offensive to everyone, everyone in our state to see that's the way that we're envisioned by people elsewhere in the country. It was funny. I was in Washington D.C. working one summer when I was in college, and this was an internship, and it was a program for other pre-law students, and somebody from Pennsylvania, which is has many rural parts, was saying, "Where are you from?" And at the time, I grew up in Georgia, so I said, "Well, I was from Georgia." And she said, "Well, how did you get those shoes?" I said, "Well, we do have shoes down south, but it was just too funny. This was 2002 or so, and people still have these ideas that are really absurd.
How insane!
Well, yeah, it is funny.
Well, I was with a company and took a business trip. Their headquarters was in one of the Donald Trump buildings in New York, and I was there. And this lady was just, "You're from Alabama?" I mean, and I couldn't help it, Alan. I said, "You know what? I even have all my teeth and they're white." I just had to say that. I probably shouldn't have, but she looked at me. We wound up actually being friends. And she said, It was just, she said, that's what people say. It's the news media. Alan, we're going to have to cut to a break. You hang around, okay? We still have some things we want to talk about.
Fox News Radio, I'm Lisa Lacera.
They're going to be able to buy a coverage policy that they want for themselves and for their family. They're going to have the kind of choices that they want.
Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price reacting to the report from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office on the Republican health care plan. The CBO says 14 million Americans would lose coverage next year under the plan, and that number would grow to 24 million by 2026. Millions of people along the East Coast bracing for what could be the biggest snowstorm of the year. Blizzard warnings issued for New York City, parts of New Jersey and Connecticut, where forecasters say 2 feet of snow is possible. Massachusetts expected to be hit hard.
We're asking people to stay off the roads, dress warmly if you go out, and when you go out and shovel your sidewalks, be careful.
Boston Mayor Marty Walsh, thousands of flights canceled or delayed. Amtrak already modifying its schedule. Fox News, we report, you decide.
Okay, have a very special guest with us right now, and his name is Alan Mendenhall. Always a pleasure to have Alan with us on the show on at least once a month. And got a lot of crazy, busy stuff going on in his world right now, but a great information coming from Alan. Now, Alan, you were talking about a book you've written, and we were just discussing that. Now, you also have other writing activities?
I do. I am a contributor to The Hill, which is a magazine in D.C., and I write for many different publications. I've written for Newsweek, The American Spectator, the American Conservative, Chronicles magazine, the Southern Humanities Review, Story South, which is a literary publication, the Texas Review of Law and Politics, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the South Carolina Review. I'm constantly writing. I try to write every day between 5 to 10 pages. Stephen King, the horror novelist, says he tries to write 10 pages every day. And, the 10 pages he writes may not be in perfect form, but he can go back and revise later. The important thing is getting all the thoughts onto paper. That's the hard part, to avoid writer's block and all those challenging mental problems with writing. But once you get everything down, then the revising is much easier. So I've sort of taken my cue from, of all people, Stephen King, even though I don't write anything like the genre that he writes, and I still follow his rigorous methods and try to write between 5 and 10 pages a day. And I write in all kinds of genres. I sometimes write poetry. I write nonfiction. I've just finished my book on Oswald Holmes Jr., Supreme Court Justice, and then there's the Corrington book I talked about. My first book, which was published in 2014, was a book of literary criticism from a free market economic perspective. Is sort of a counterpart to all the Marxist literary criticism that you get in English departments. I wanted to defend free enterprise and the free market as an alternative mode of looking at literary texts, and then I'll write just kind of op-eds for newspapers and magazines and profile pieces on interesting writers, interesting judges, and I pretty much just constantly writing whatever strikes my fancy. I like to write a lot of book reviews.
Well, what's the difference between writing, let's say, an article for a magazine, and how different would that be from writing a book?
Well, it's much different in that the book, I sort of have a long-term project. Well, for my first book, I actually didn't know I was writing a book. What I was doing was writing a lot of different articles for peer-reviewed journals, and they were all they all had sort of the same theme. And then as I got to a certain point, I said, well, all these articles sort of have a through line. Maybe I ought to collect these together and repurpose them into a book, which is what I did. With my book on Holmes, that was my PhD dissertation that I reworked into a book. And with Corrington, it was just something I was interested on many years, and that's an addition. So that's mostly his work with my commentary on it. The other book that I have coming out this summer is a book of creative nonfiction essays. So they're just stories that I would write based on my childhood or based on my experience. For example, the very first essay is an essay called "Of Bees and Boys," and it's just on the surface level a story about my brother and me and playing in the backyard on the swing set and rattling the swing set so that all these bees that lived in the wood of the swing set would come out. But there's a deeper meaning to the story, as readers will see, and I start thinking about what boyhood means and how these experiences, quote unquote, fighting the bees on a regular basis could be meaningful and a learning experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so many things from our youth we can take into our adult life. We can learn a lot of lessons, like to stay away from the bees.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, to stay away from the bees, and there's a lot of deep meaning behind just learning to stay away from bees. There's a lot that goes on in the psychology of a child, which is more than just, oh, bees are dangerous, I don't want to get stung.
Mm-hmm. And then the different bees that can affect your life, and I'm talking about this in another sense, but in your life as far as, and let's mention this, you mentioned Saturday Night Live a little bit earlier today. How can, and this is something that really bothers me, it seems like a lot of people get their information about what's going on in the world through a segment on Saturday Night Live instead of reading a good article. It's written by someone like yourself who actually knows what's going on in the world.
Well, I think you're onto something there. I guess I'm guilty as charged with posting stuff on Facebook. I typically don't editorialize on Facebook. I don't put my own opinions, but I do post the articles I read, and it's a pretty eclectic mix. I mean, I'll read everything from the New York Times and the New Yorker and the New York Review of Books to the LA Times, and then I'll read all the conservative publications from National Review and Weekly Standard to Chronicles Magazine and the American Conservative. But I generally just post what I read. And somebody, an old friend of mine, someone I grew up with, took issue with one of the articles that was posted and left a long commentary on my Facebook wall. And she was criticizing the piece for being fake news. But what was interesting about that criticism is that the piece was not actually news. I think what we've lost is a sense of genre. What the piece was an opinion piece, and it was a long piece about this person's views on education. But what it was not was a disinterested, dispassionate statement of the facts. That would have been appropriate for news, something you would see go across the AP wire or something. Mm-hmm. But this person was clearly a presence in the essay. It was a first-person essay. And so it wasn't news in the sense of, this is what occurred at this point today, and this is, it was not that type of a piece. So I think we have lost a sense of genre, and that we need to regain really an understanding of audience, because that's what genre is. It's knowing what this piece is written for. What is the purpose of this piece? An op-ed in a newspaper has a certain function and is intended for a certain audience, whereas, a manual, a technical manual in your driver's car has a different function. And, I wouldn't hold those two genres up against each other and compare them on their own terms. It would be like comparing apples and oranges. Mm-hmm. So even within the popular media, I think that's part of the problem with all this fake news stuff, is that people have a tough time distinguishing what is supposed to be news, what's intended to be conveyed as pure information, and what is intended to be opinion. So I think that's a long way of saying that I think you're onto something there. And clearly with the book of essays that I'm talking about, this is one thing that I do that's not political in any sense at all. It's just stories about family and being a lawyer and, just personality. I think it's a essay in the tradition of, say, Montaigne or something.
Mm-hmm.
One of those meandering, kind of reflective and pensive collections.
Well, it seems as if the difference between news and opinion has changed in the past several years. There used to be a distinctive line between the two. So that's just somebody's opinion. You just brush it off. But now it's like the opinions are in the news now.
Well, that's true too, and that's an interesting observation because number one, there are a lot more op-eds than there used to be. When you look at the paper, there are a lot more opinion pieces. And number two, you're right, the opinions themselves have become newsworthy topics. So you have news about opinions about news, and these layers of mediation become confusing to the audience. And so I completely agree with you there, and especially in this age when our broadcasters and our television personalities and political pundits have become celebrities in a way that they weren't before. I think you and I have spoken about this in the past, where in the elections you had the moderators, up there grabbing all the attention when most of us really wanted to see the candidates and have the candidates.
Yeah, that was the whole point.
Hear the candidates.
That was the point
right.
of the debate. Yeah.
But we're at a time when the news industry is ubiquitous and booming and wildly profitable, and it creates celebrities, and we have a weird sort of TV talking head celebrity culture going on, and I think that you're right there. At this point, if let's just say Bill O'Reilly or Sean Hannity, or it could be anybody, Megyn Kelly, went out and did something in the streets, or whatever, went to a restaurant, you might see news about that.
Mm-hmm.
Or anything they say, any slip of the tongue, any just minor error they may make in their broadcast could be itself news. So you have news about news, and it's sort of an incestuous media.
Mm-hmm.
in a weird way. It's media signaling other media, and it signals under other media, and the news, the actual facts on the ground get kind of lost in all the different messaging between networks.
Well, it's like you're looking for they're looking for the next blooper. They're looking for the next mistake, and that makes news more than what's really going on in the U.S., what's really going on inside the political world.
Yeah, then I agree with you there too. It used to be that reporting was all about getting a story, and
you would be fired if you didn't get the story right.
That's right. The story was the story. Now it's always a game of gotcha, where you're trying to make your reporting of the story itself another story. Mm-hmm. If I can make this person say something controversial, or if I can catch this person stating something politically incorrect, then I can have that gotcha moment, and then all of a sudden I go famous as the person that exposes the inner thoughts, or as the person that tricked this interviewee into saying something wrong or foolish, mm-hmm. rather than just, getting the person's perspective and getting their, rather than trying to trick them into saying, or rather than trying to put them in tough situations, you should really be trying to get information.
Mm-hmm. But what seems to be happening, though, is that person may be famous for a while for being the gotcha person, but then it's always a short fuse. I mean, they go up really tall, but then they go out really fast as well.
Well, I think that's probably true, too. I really enjoyed, I don't know if you saw this, but there was a professor from South Korea giving an interview about relations with North Korea over the weekend. I think it was maybe either last Thursday or last Friday. Mm-hmm. And he was live on BBC, and he was Skyping in. And then in the background, his two children come through the door, and they come in, and the older one knocks some books off, and the little one is a little baby in a little walker, and the baby comes in, and then all of a sudden you see the mom burst in the background and grab the kids. And meanwhile, the interview keeps going with all this in the background. It is hilarious. If you haven't seen it, you have to just Google it. It's a really funny interview. So you had this one guy that just became really famous over the weekend because of his kids bursting in on his interview.
Well, that can definitely happen. Definitely. So how do you stay focused? I you do a lot of writing. So how do you stay focused?
Well, my wife would argue that I don't. that I am spread thin and that I can be kind of scatterbrained. But really, I don't know. I mean, I write a to-do list out every morning and I cross things off, and then at the end of the day, I revise the to-do list and leave things on that didn't get finished, and then I start over with it the next day. And I just work. I really, really like working. I love reading. I love writing. I love the world of ideas. I'm passionate about ideas, and I try to spread the ideas that I believe to be true and correct. And I'm interested in people and just interested in what's going on in the world. So I guess maybe it's like Corrington. Maybe I have some curiosity that I'm always trying to satisfy, but you never can, because as C.S. Peirce said, there's always this irritation of doubt. Once you learn something else, you always get a little bit skeptical about something else you know about, or you begin to doubt something else that you know. So the more that you know, the more you realize you don't know, and you just constantly are exploring things. And maybe that's just what I'm a victim of, is my own curiosity.
Well, I think it's a good thing, because, and I'll tell you something, I've noticed another trend is I'm out there and I'm talking with folks in the area and even folks outside of the area, and what they say is bad news sells. I mean, that's what they say, but I'd like to know who they is. But this is the thing.
Yeah.
They say bad news sells. I don't think it does. Because a lot of folks are pretty much well like me. We go find our own information. And I'll have to tell you, the only thing I really watch as far as a news program is the weather. I want to find out, what they think may happen with the weather. And because I've just heard so much bashing that to me it's like, well, it's not new. You're still bashing. There's no new news.
I agree with you. And when you watch news and they put the talking heads up and they'll fight for 5 minutes and then they get off, and you think about it and you say, well, what did I learn in that? In that 5 minutes, I could have read an informative article and really learned something about the issues, but instead I got worked up. My blood pressure went up because I saw two people fighting, and I rooted for one person and not the other, but I didn't really learn anything. I didn't really get anything out of that was really constructive at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have with me right now, sometimes I fail to say who I have on the show, but a very special guest with me right now, Alan Mendenhall, and he is the Associate Dean and Executive Director of the Blackstone Center for Law and Liberty, and very pleased to have him on the show, always, please. But let me ask a question. In your opinion, and I value your opinion, but I really do, you wouldn't be on the show, but let's talk a little bit about, the news versus President Trump's tweets. I'll have to tell you. I'll have to tell you what I think about it first, and let's see. Then let's tell you if you think I'm crazy. I would much rather get the tweets. I feel more confident about the tweet. I know they're a little out there and a little outlandish sometimes, but I feel like I'm getting more information. I'm getting more of what's really going on with the tweets.
Well, you're certainly getting a more authentic, unmediated access to the president. I mean, it's
that's what I'd rather have. I feel like
is what he thinks,
and a lot of folks are saying the same thing. Is that they say they've turned the news off?
Well, it's still interesting to me why he's doing. I can't figure out if he is. In some ways, it seems like masterful. I mean, it really connects with people, and it never seems to blow up the way the media expects it to.
He keeps doing it. They say, next time he's really going to do himself in. Well, he hasn't yet.
Well, yeah, and they'll say something, and the media might criticize him and say, well, can you believe Trump said such and such and such and such? And what the American people hear is, whoa, Trump was up at 4 a.m. tweeting? He was already awake and working? They almost don't care. It seems
to backfire.
Yeah, it does. It always seems to backfire. So I don't know. I find it to be fascinating because it's never happened before. We've never seen something like this. So it's just every day is something new to watch, and it's very fascinating to watch unfold.
It is. So do you think we're entering a new world here where, we'll still always have news, but where you can get more information from the person who's sending the tweet? Do you see a trend coming?
Well, I think so. I really do. So when back, I guess, what was that? Maybe, was that 2 years ago when there were the bombings in Paris outside the stadium and then the shootings inside the coffee shop? And I just happened to be on Twitter when I started seeing this stuff trend. And then I was just reading people's tweets about stuff. And then all of a sudden, I started getting news alerts on my phone. But that was 10 or 15 minutes after it happened. Mm-hmm. And even then, it was like reports of shots fired and things like that. And it wasn't what was actually happening. Meanwhile, I was reading through Twitter, getting live reports about what was going on. Of course, you can never verify what's true or what's not, or if somebody's got a perspective that's just wrong based on the angle that they're looking at or whatever. But I do find that fascinating that now media does come from the ground up rather than the top down in a way that I think is fairly new, especially in light of the ubiquity of the internet. I mean, everyone can have access to the same news. I mean, we could get on right now and look at people tweeting in China or Japan and find out real time what is happening there. That's a pretty amazing thing. And I don't think, we're so immersed in our own era that it's hard to understand what that means. But, maybe hundreds of years from now, we'll look back at this moment and think, well, wow, what an interesting time to live in.
It's very interesting, and I love living in this time. I know it's just kind of scary sometimes, but I think about it this way: when someone is tweeting, President Trump sends a tweet out, I feel like I'm getting the more of the whole information instead of a soundbite.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it's a lot different from some monarch issuing orders that have to get passed on through different subsidiaries and eventually make its way down to the people in some form that is meant. But
by the time it gets to us, we're not getting the whole thing. It's just like I told you about going to to see President Trump. Of course, it was before he was president, in Birmingham, and the incident that happened there with the gentleman who threw himself on the ground screaming and yelling. Well, you saw a sound bite of what happened. We were there, and it was not like the sound bite. He gave the guy 3 chances to speak up and say, whatever his problem was. And it was nothing like was reported on the news. He gave him 3 chances, and the guy just would not cooperate. He was just screaming, cursing with kids around, and so finally, he said, "Well, get rid of him. Tell him, get him out of here." Well, all you heard was "get him out of here." You didn't hear 3 chances for the guy to please speak up and say what he wanted to say.
Yeah, there's still an ability for the media because of its predominance and the control it has on messaging to manufacture events in the way that they want them to be conveyed or reported. So I think that's still problematic. I also have experiences similar to the one that you just mentioned, where I've been present for things that transpired in one way, and when I went home that evening to look at how they were reported, it was like I was looking at two completely different things.
I mean, you look at yourself in the mirror and say, I actually saw it happen a different way. Alan, great having you on the show. Less than a minute left in this segment. Well, great, and good luck to you. I know you got a lot of stuff going on, and I know it's going to work out. It will. I have total confidence in you. Alan Mendenhall, Associate Dean and Executive Director with the Blackstone Center for Law and Liberty, with us right now. How can folks find your book?
Well, they're all going to be on Amazon. So if you just go into Amazon.com now and type Alan Mendenhall, my first 2 books will come up, and my next 2, which will be coming out in about a month or 2, will be up there in about a month or 2.
I definitely want it. When I order one, can you sign it for me?
Oh, I would love to.
Awesome. Okay, I can't wait. Okay, everybody, we're going to have to call it today. Thank you so much, Alan, for being on the show as always. Everybody have a great night and stay weather aware.